In the stillness before dawn, a narrator's voice cuts through the darkness in her own words. In the year 2025, Red China will march into Russia. This chilling invocation sets the stage for an exploration that feels part Gothic fable, part sober geopolitical briefing. We weave the mystique of Jeane Dixon's 1969 prophecy famously resurfacing in recent times of India. Summaries and YouTube exposes with today's stark realities, inviting listeners to ponder the seductive pull of dramatic forecasts against the grain of nuanced facts as the tale unfolds. We oscillate between deep dives into Dixon's life, her meteoric rise as a mid-century psychic, the so-called Jeane Dixon effect of selective memory and objective commentary on the alliances shaping 2025. In one breath, we feel the suspense of a shadowy war narrative. In the next, we examine how, in reality, China and Russia publicly deepen strategic ties rather than draw steel on each other's borders, with leaders signing partnership statements. As recently as May 2025, the story pauses to reflect on global economic undercurrents, while Dixon envisioned a China strong enough to conquer. Today's data reveal a world navigating slowing growth, trade frictions, and cautious stimulus. World Bank forecasts trim and IMF warnings echoing through markets. This alternating rhythm-haunting storytelling punctuated by rigorous analysis keeps listeners on edge. Is prophecy a portent or simply a mirror for our fears? By blending evocative sound design and voice actor dramatizations of Dixon's ominous lines with crisp, up-to-date reporting on mid-2025 realities, the paragraph culminates in a climax of revelation. The greatest mystery may lie not in whether prophecy comes true, but in why we so eagerly yearn for narratives that dramatize the uncertainties of our world. In the hush of a candlelit study, one might almost hear the whisper of a bygone seer as we begin to unravel the enigma of Jeane Dixon. Born Lydia Emma Pinckert on January 5, 1904, in Medford, Wisconsin, she emerged mid-century as America's most celebrated and most controversial psychic. Her syndicated newspaper astrology column and best-selling memoirs amplifying both her promise and her puzzles. Picture a young woman raised between Missouri and California, claiming early encounters with mysterious portents that paved her path toward advising presidents and captivating the public imagination. Yet, beneath the glamour lies a tapestry threaded with as many misfires as purported triumphs. The drama of her life reads like a mythic saga, a devout Catholic who courted headlines by predicting the assassination of John F. Kennedy, a forecast so potent that it cemented her reputation, even as retrospective scholars question the timing and specificity of that foretelling. This duality gives rise to the so-called Jeane Dixon effect, a phenomenon whereby the glow of a few remembered hits eclipses the shadow of innumerable overlooked misses, fueled by media sensationalism and human penchant for confirmation bias. Listeners today, attuned to deep analysis and skeptical curiosity alike, find themselves drawn into a narrative that alternates between whispered awe at Dixon's dramatic pronouncements and clear-eyed scrutiny of her track record. Did she truly foresee world-altering events, or did the magic lie in artful vagueness, retroactive fitting, and the irresistible allure of mystery? Even now, in mid-2025, new articles resurface her most ominous forecast cast in chilling tones. In the year 2025, Red China will march into Russia. Yet we must pause, as modern geopolitics often tell a different story of strategic partnerships rather than conquest dramas, prompting us to interrogate how and why such prophecies persist in public discourse. The fascination endures because we crave narratives that transform uncertainty into a spine-tingling story. Our collective psyche yearns for oracles who promise a glimpse beyond the veil, even as objective commentary reminds us that global realities are woven of complex alliances, economic data, and evolving power balances that seldom conform to stark, cinematic scripts. In weaving this tale, we plunge into Dixon's meteoric rise, her charitable works, her brushes with Hollywood and Washington elites, and then pivot sharply to examine the litany of her predictions that fizzled, cures for cancer by a certain date, peace-strewn futures that never materialized, and geopolitical upheavals that remain confined to speculative pages. This alternating rhythm romantic storytelling that evokes smoky parlors and crystal balls, interlaced with updated, fact-driven analysis of 2025 circumstances, keeps the story's tension taut. Will listeners succumb to the seductive pull of prophecy, or will they emerge with a keener sense of how hindsight and narrative framing shape our belief in the mystic voice by presenting Dixon's biography not merely as a chronicle of uncanny pronouncements, but as a mirror reflecting our own desires and doubts. We guide audiences through a climax of revelation. The real mystery is not whether any prophecy comes true, but why we so fervently retell and revisit these stories, especially when modern reporting and scholarship urge us to weigh evidence over enchantment. Thus, the segment closes on a note both evocative and analytical. A candle flickers as we ask, in the voice of both skeptic and storyteller, how the legacy of Jeane Dixon both illuminates and obscures the unpredictable tapestry of our shared future. In a hushed, almost reverential tone, imagine unveiling Jeane Dixon's 1969 vision for my life and prophecies, where she intones, in the year 2025, Red China will have reached an economic and political stability sufficient to forge ahead and become the great conqueror, followed by the chilly march. In that year, Red China will march into Russia, conquer a large part of the USSR's northern area, and will not stop until it has moved into Finland, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, stopping at the German border, and then the broader sweep. It will not invade Western Europe, but by that time, Russia will also have expanded her direct sphere of influence. It will no longer be limited to the countries of Eastern Europe, but will now include Libya, Ethiopia, Iran, and much of Africa. Culminating in the ominous timeline, this war of conquest will last from 2025 to 2037. These lines, resurfacing in YouTube exposes like Jeane Dixon's 2025 prophecy, what you didn't know, spark a shiver of mystery as they float through the digital ether. Yet, as we lean in to savor the drama, objective commentary beckons. In mid-2025, geopolitical realities tell a story of deepening strategic partnership. Rather than cinematic invasion, rather than armies clashing on Siberian tundras, we find President Xi Jinping making his 11th visit to Moscow, signing joint statements to deepen the no-limits partnership with Vladimir Putin, and channeling multi-billion-dollar funding into joint projects, even as sanctions drive Belarus and other states closer to Beijing's orbit. The narrative tension crescendos as we juxtapose Dixon's stark prophecy, delivered with a tone designed to provoke awe and dread with the nuanced rhythms of May and June 2025. China's export growth slows under trade frictions and deflationary pressures, while leaders emphasize cooperation on energy, finance, and international law rather than plotting territorial conquest. This alternation between the haunted wonder of a psychic's vision and the crisp facts of today sustains a dramatic arc. Listeners feel the pull of a suspenseful saga, only to have the ground shift beneath them with data about slowly rising trade tensions, cautious economic forecasts, and diplomatic rendezvous that underscore mutual interests over martial ambitions. In crafting the tale, one might evoke creaking doors and distant thunder when reading the prophecy, then abruptly pivot to the hum of modern trade routes, satellite imagery of joint energy pipelines, and headline bulletins about high-level meetings, reaffirming shared opposition to unilateral sanctions. A stark, factual counterpoint to the shadowy invasion of blow. By embedding these verbatim passages within a narrative that alternates between evocative storytelling and up-to-the-minute analysis citing Times of India and Axor.az for the prophecy text and Reuters dispatches on May 2025 developments, we heighten suspense yet honor rigor, reminding listeners that the allure of prophetic drama often collides with the messiness of real-world geopolitics. Ultimately, the climax arrives not with armies crossing borders, but with the revelation that our fascination with portentous forecast reveals as much about our own anxieties and narrative cravings as it does about any future event and invitation to question why dramatic tales endure even when current affairs paint a far more intricate, less sensational picture of our shared world. In a hushed, almost reverential tone, imagine unveiling Jeane Dixon's 1969 vision for my life and prophecies, where she intones, in the year 2025, Red China will have reached an economic and political stability sufficient to forge ahead and become the great conqueror, followed by the chilly march. In that year, Red China will march into Russia, conquer a large part of the USSR's northern area, and will not stop until it has moved into Finland, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, stopping at the German border, and then the broader sweep. It will not invade Western Europe, but by that time, Russia will also have expanded her direct sphere of influence. It will no longer be limited to the countries of Eastern Europe, but will now include Libya, Ethiopia, Iran, and much of Africa. Culminating in the ominous timeline, This war of conquest will last from 2025 to 2037. These lines, resurfacing. In YouTube exposes like Jeane Dixon's 2025 prophecy, what you didn't know, spark a shiver of mystery as they float through the digital ether. Yet, as we lean in to savor the drama, objective commentary beckons. In mid-2025, geopolitical realities tell a story of deepening strategic partnership. Rather than cinematic invasion, rather than armies clashing on Siberian tundras, we find President Xi Jinping making his 11th visit to Moscow, signing joint statements to deepen the no-limits partnership with Vladimir Putin, and channeling multi-billion-dollar funding into joint projects, even as sanctions drive Belarus and other states closer to Beijing's orbit. The narrative tension crescendos as we juxtapose Dixon's stark prophecy, delivered with a tone designed to provoke awe and dread with the nuanced rhythms of May. At June 2025, China's export growth slows under trade frictions and deflationary pressures, while leaders emphasize cooperation on energy, finance, and international law rather than plotting territorial conquest. This alternation between the haunted wonder of a psychic's vision and the crisp facts of today sustains a dramatic arc. Listeners feel the pull of a suspenseful saga, only to have the ground shift beneath them with data about slowly rising trade tensions, cautious economic forecasts, and diplomatic rendezvous that underscore mutual interests over martial ambitions. In crafting the tale, one might evoke creaking doors and distant thunder when reading the prophecy, then abruptly pivot to the hum of modern trade routes, satellite imagery of joint energy pipelines, and headline bulletins about high-level meetings, reaffirming shared opposition to unilateral sanctions. A stark, factual counterpoint to the shadowy invasion of blow. By embedding these verbatim passages within a narrative that alternates between evocative storytelling and up-to-the-minute analysis citing Times of India and Axor.az for the prophecy text and Reuters dispatches on May 2025 developments, we heighten suspense yet honor rigor, reminding listeners that the allure of prophetic drama often collides with the messiness of real-world geopolitics. Ultimately, the climax arrives not with armies crossing borders, but with the revelation that our fascination with portentous forecast reveals as much about our own anxieties and narrative cravings as it does about any future event and invitation. To question why dramatic tales endure even when current affairs paint a far more intricate, less sensational picture of our shared world. A shadow has fallen across the vast expanse of our world. In 2025, whispering of alliances and betrayals far more intricate than the bold evasion foretold by ancient seers. In the flickering half-light of May, as Xi Jinping disembarked in Moscow beneath an overcast sky, one might have expected gunmetal gray and the tension of two great beasts poised to clash, but instead found intimate handshakes, smiling emissaries, and agreements sealing ever-deepening ties of trade, energy, and technology. It was as though destiny itself had paused, breath caught, to witness China and Russia weaving a tapestry of cooperation so seamless that the prophet's visions of bloody borders and thunderous armies dissolving in the dawn seemed almost laughable. Beneath this veneer of concord, however, a quiet undercurrent of caution rippled. China hedges its bets over Ukraine, wary that too close an embrace might drag it into the fires of war, while Russia, still reeling from the grinding conflict on Ukrainian soil, extends its arms across Africa and the Middle East with the fervor of a wounded lion, reclaiming lost territories, offering weapons to desert militias, constructing pipelines in the dusty hinterlands, and sowing its influence like seeds in foreign earth. Meanwhile, the North watches in guarded vigilance. No Chinese legion has marched through Siberian forests or up towards Stockholm. Instead, the Scandinavian nations have retreated behind a fortress of solidarity, bolstering their defenses under NATO's protective wing. From the fjords to the Baltic Sea, coastal batteries hum with readiness, while parliaments debate budgetary increases in hushed tones, as though recalling a long-forgotten prophecy that once promised sudden turmoil in northern skies. Yet the very absence of conflict there fuels a deeper unease. If the storm clouds do not gather where the scrolls claimed they would, then perhaps the real tempest is forming somewhere else. In the subtle bargains and secret handshakes that reshape continents in silence, this is no fever dream of expansionist glories. This is geopolitics as a high-stakes drama, where each headline becomes a plot twist and every state visit a clandestine maneuver. Picture the Kremlin's grand halls, where portraits of long-dead Tsars observe Chinese delegations signing contracts that bind their fates, and imagine the corridors of Beijing's power hall, where Russian generals scrutinize blueprints for joint missile systems. Trade volumes surge to record highs even as talk of spheres of influence. Feels archaic, no conquering armies march down empty roads, but influence creeps like ivy, wrapping itself around governments willing to barter sovereignty for security or profit. And yet, in these subtle plays, the prophecy's shadow persists. It is the memory of a world that might have been, of armies locked in mortal embrace under crimson banners, of borders redrawn by the steel of tanks. That memory quickens the pulse of every diplomat who rises to speak at summits, every soldier who patrols the Arctic frontier, every journalist who pens the next dispatch by satellite phone. From a distant battlefield, it is in this tension between prophecy and reality, between the clamor of imagined war and the hush of strategic partnership that the real story unfurls, demanding both deep analysis and the heart-stopping suspense of a cliffhanger. For though China and Russia today stand hand in hand, and though Scandinavia sleeps uneasily behind fortified walls, the future's true climax is unwritten. Somewhere in the silent backrooms where treaties are forged and futures sealed, the next act waits, and history will judge whether these alliances herald an age of peace or merely mask the gathering storm. A hush hangs over the world's markets. In 2025, as if the air itself carries the weight of unseen forces and intricate polycrisis, we're tangled. Supply chains, surging prices, crushing debts, and the mounting fury of a changed climate converge like storm fronts on the horizon. In this shadow theater, China moves not as a triumphant conqueror, but as a cautious giant gingerly tracing its steps. Growth has slowed to a haunted rhythm, the pall of an aging population and towering liabilities draping its vast economy in muted tones, even as the belt and road's arteries pulse with the promise of connection. There is no roaring crescendo of resources marshaled for conquest, only the steady, almost imperceptible hum of digital trade platforms and whispering boardrooms where technocrats and financiers extol the virtues of a peaceful rise. And yet, beneath those polished presentations, friction snakes through factory districts and banking halls alike, a reminder that ambition must forever wrestle with fragility. Far to the west, Russia's economic engine sputters under the iron grip of sanctions, its once mighty revenues drawn from oil and gas now dripping more slowly into the Kremlin's coffers. There are glimmers of adaptation pipelines pointing ever eastward, new pacts inked under neon skies in Beijing and Ulaanbaatar, but these shifts feel like desperate maneuvers by a strategic chess player cornered on his own board. Factories designed for a world that no longer buys freely stand silent, and in the corridors of Moscow's government, debates rage over how to steady a vessel listing from sanctions-heavy seas. Yet, amid the contraction and quiet panic, there is also a strange resilience. Farmers in Siberia till frozen earth to feed distant cities. Tech startups in Novosibirsk code solutions that bypass Western components, a defiance that simmers, suggesting that collapse is never final, where pride and necessity intertwine. Across continents, emerging markets risk suffocation beneath the twin specters of debt distress and runaway inflation, while central banks and finance ministers gather like modern-day alchemists, searching their ledgers for the formula that might stabilize a teetering world. Climate shocks batter harvests and coastlines in turn, imposing an invisible toll that morphs spreadsheets into prophecies of scarcity. Yet even here, among the tremors of uncertainty, lies a testament to endurance. Grassroots initiatives sprout in sun-bleached villages to harvest solar energy. Urban planners in storm-prone deltas sketch ambitious flood defenses on digital canvases. Ordinary people shoulder the weight of a complex global illness with a stubborn hope that no single crisis can vanquish human ingenuity. This is no grand unraveling of civilization for which seers once warned. It is instead a taut, living drama, rich in nuance and suspense. The prophecy of an all-consuming economic cataclysm dissolves beneath the glare of resilience, an adaptation replaced by a mosaic of precarious strengths and lingering vulnerabilities. Imagine, for a moment, the command centers in Beijing and Moscow, screens flickering with data feeds from ports and power plants, while advisors whisper counsel steeped in both optimism and dread. Picture finance ministers poring over IMF dispatches by lamplight, fingers stained with the ink of emergency bond issuances, hearts quickening at the prospect of default. See farmers replanting fields after floods, entrepreneurs coding new financial tools to skirt credit crunches, citizens debating the price of bread in marketplaces that echo with both anxiety and resolve. And so the curtain lifts on the next act, of our shared economic story, not a tale of unbridled conquest or apocalyptic collapse, but a winding saga of adaptation, tension, and the fragile alchemy of survival. The climax remains unwritten, suspended in the hush between crises and solutions, and it is here in the interplay of stagnant growth and stirring innovation, in the brinksmanship of sanctions and the quiet resilience of ordinary lives that the true drama of 2025 unfolds. Only when the last ledger is balanced and the final pipeline secured will we know whether this era becomes a chapter of triumph or a warning etched in the annals of history. In the dim glow of candlelight, we trace the echo of Dixon's most startling forecast voices from the past that reverberate into our modern anxieties, only to discover that the true power of prophecy lies not in its literal accuracy, but in the spell it casts on our collective imagination. Why do these dramatic visions endure in a world brimming with real-time data and instant fact-checks? The answer lies in the alchemy of narrative appeal and confirmation bias. We hunger for sweeping, cinematic tales that promise clarity amid chaos, and our minds retroactively mold fuzzy predictions that fit the contours of events already etched in our headlines. Consider how countless videos and social media posts resurrected Dixon's chilling pronouncement, China will march into Russia, this spring, weaving it into TikTok clips warning of great power fractures. Even as May and June 2025 saw President Xi Jinping and President Putin embracing on the Kremlin steps, to herald a no-limits partnership rather than clash over Siberian wastelands. These after-the-fact alignments, known as retrospective fitting, transform open-ended prophecies into supposed proofs, and by the time we recognize the sleight of hand, the narrative has already taken root in our fears. History offers a gallery of such spectral visions. In 1958, pronouncements of a looming World War III gripped readers, only for the crisis to dissipate into diplomatic standoffs. The economic tremors that Dixon and her contemporaries predicted in the 1970s gave way instead to the dot-com boom and the polycrisis of overlapping market shocks, climate disasters, and pandemic aftershocks that define our present moment. And yet, despite the litany of unmet doomsday forecasts, great power tensions persist in new Giza cyber skirmishes, AI-driven arms races, and contested claims in the South China Sea, reminding us that, while the specifics of prophecy may falter, the patterns of geopolitics often echo familiar rhythms. To untangle fact from fabrication, we invite a skeptical expert, perhaps a historian of prophetic lore, or a cognitive psychologist, to step forward, their measured voice cutting through the dramatic haze to explain how our brains favor stories over statistics and how sensationalist media amplify every ominous utterance. This critical perspective does not dismiss the allure of prophetic drama, but reframes it. We learn that prophecies are as much about the anxieties and hopes of their listeners as they are about any future event, and that each recited prediction is a mirror reflecting our quest for certainty in an uncertain age. In weaving this segment, we balance the spine-tingling thrill of ancient warnings sound design with low rumbles and echoes of distant horns with incisive commentary on why, even in mid-2025, when satellite imagery, trade data, and live diplomatic streams offer transparent insight into global affairs, we remain captivated by the mystic's whisper. The narrative crescendos as we realize that the greatest revelation may not be that prophecies fail or succeed, but that our enduring fascination with them reveals an elemental truth. We are story-hungry creatures who, faced with a world of complexity, seek to distill uncertainty into a single, memorable arc. And so we close this chapter not with a verdict on Dixon's accuracy, but with a question posed in the flickering lamplight. What do our own desires and fears tell us when we choose to believe despite the evidence that the future can be foretold? In a dimly lit studio, your episode begins with a heartbeat of suspense, a lone voice intoning, in the year 2025, China will march into Russia, before shattering the spell with a crisp question, but what is happening today? From there, the narrative unfurls like an ancient scroll, whisking listeners back to a smoky 1960s newsroom where a youthful Jeane Dixon first penned her ominous forecasts, the crackle of archival audio lending authenticity to the tale. As the story builds, we weave in expert interviews voiced by historians, geopolitical analysts, and economists, each soundbite calibrated to alternate between hushed awe and incisive commentary, so that every revelation feels both mysterious and rigorously examined. Mid-episode, the tension crescendos as present-day, on-the-ground reports arrive, Clips of President Xi Jinping's May 2025 summit in Moscow, where rather than armies clashing, steel-blazed handshakes sealed new energy and tech partnerships, snapshots of stalled export data that belie any grand conquest narrative, and flashing tickers of global market indices underscoring the fragile, polycrisis economy we truly inhabit. Then, like a novelist pausing at the peak of a cliffhanger, you inject a reflection break. What would you do if you believed this prophecy? Inviting listeners into the story and urging them to confront their own fears. Throughout, strategic music transitions guide emotion-ominous low strings when Dixon's climb is dramatized, shifting to a more contemplative piano motif as analysts debunk the myths while sound designers layer subtle wind whistles to evoke frozen northern plains whenever the march into Russia line resurfaces. To sustain momentum, each segment closes with a teaser. Up next, can China's Belt and Road truly reshape Africa as foretold, ensuring listeners lean in for the next act. Real quotes from think tank reports and mid-2025 economic briefs anchor the drama in fact, and polls invited via social media. Do you find these predictions plausible? Transform passive listeners into active participants. Technically, the episode remains lean and potent, with each chapter origin flashback, prophecy reading, expert analysis, real-time reporting clocking in at a tight 5 to 7 minutes. To preserve pacing and build toward a climactic finale, here, the narrative converges. Dixon's prophetic flair is cast in stark relief against the messy, data-driven contours of today's world, prompting a final, open-ended speculation that echoes long after the lights dim. Are we chasing clairvoyance, or simply our own desire to script certainty into an uncertain future? By blending evocative storytelling, current geopolitical and economic upgrades, and interactive elements, this structure transforms a prophecy-driven tale into a living, breathing journey that leaves listeners suspended between the allure of the unknown and the clarity of hard evidence. In the flickering aftermath of our exploration, we confront a truth as haunting as any prophecy. Jeane Dixon's 2025 vision, with its foreboding imagery of conquest and upheaval, makes for irresistible drama. Yet the real story unfolding in mid-2025 tells a far subtler tale of strategic partnership rather than all-out war, where Dixon conjured an unstoppable great conqueror. Today we witness President Xi Jinping and President Putin sharing stages and signing accords to deepen energy ties and technology collaboration, reinforcing a no-limits alliance that reflects mutual caution more than aggressive expansion. Economically, the prophecy's premise of stability to wage conquest dissolves under the weight of a polycrisis. World sluggish growth in China, inflationary pressures in Europe, debt distress in emerging markets, and climate-driven disruptions that confound any simple narrative of unbridled strength. And yet, amidst these complex realities, the legacy of Dixon's words endures, a testament to our collective tendency to elevate a handful of striking forecasts, while relegating countless misses to oblivion, a phenomenon scholars call the Jeane Dixon effect, where selective memory weaves fiction into fact. As the final notes of our story fade, we urge listeners to carry forward a practiced skepticism, interrogate sensational claims, seek the full context behind each ominous utterance, and remember that the true measure of prophecy lies not in its theatrical flourish, but in the rigor of evidence. Let this reflection be your guide when you next encounter a dire prediction, be it on TikTok, a late-night broadcast, or a glossy newsletter. Pause to ask, what do the data say, and who stands to gain from my unease? Our world's greatest mysteries are not bound in cryptic pronouncements, but in the interplay of human hope, fear, and the unpredictable currents of history. Stay curious, remain critical, and join us for our next episode, where we'll unmask another modern prophecy and weigh its bold claims against the hard-won insights of today's geopolitics and economics.